Okay, lovely. I think we can probably kick off now. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us and welcome. I'm Rosie McKenzie. I'm the Senior Company Engagement Manager here in the Responsible Business team at Thomson Reuters Foundation at TRF. Welcome to our Responsible Business webinar on the gender pay gap, where we're going to be seeking to further the conversation around the persistent inequalities. A little bit of feedback there from someone, sorry, between men and women in the workplace. If we could go to the next slide, please, Polly. Perfect, thank you. In this webinar, we aim to highlight the crucial role of transparent reporting in addressing these disparities and promoting workplace equality. Later, we'll hear from Mari Schwartzer from Shareholder Commons, who will talk a little about closing the pay gap from a system stewardship lens. But first, the WI team will share some of their findings on pay gaps from our WI 2024 data, as well as giving a brief overview of the impacts pay gaps can have on both investors and companies. There'll be a chance for Q&A at the end. Thank you for joining us in this important dialogue where together we can foster a more equitable and inclusive future for all. And if you do have any questions throughout, please do feel free to use the Q&A function in Zoom, and then we'll field them at the end as we've mentioned. So I'm now going to hand over to Joy to talk a bit from the WI data perspective. Thanks, Joy.
Hi, hello everyone. I'm Joy Zhang. I'm a senior research and sustainability manager here, and I'm gonna walk you guys through about some the key data point about gender pay gap. And this is also the launch of our gender pay gap fact sheets. So everything I was talking about, you can request the full fact sheets after this webinar. So let's take a look of the first chart from the left. We are very positively see the decrease of the gender pay gap across the most recent 3 years. So we can say from 2022, the gender pay gap among all the responding company to WDI, there's the 15%. And then very good some improvements is happening until last year, 2004. We are able to see the gender pay gap was closed to 10% in 2004. And also there are some other stats we haven't included in this slide, which is the median of the gender pay gap, which is 6% in 2004. That means we can say more than half companies who disclosing to us are able to manage their gender pay gap is less than 6%, which we think is very big step up for the gender equality in the workspace. And also we can take another look of some sector comparison and regional trends. So based on our data set, we realize there's lots of disparity of the gender pay gap among different sectors. So for the healthcare companies who disclose it to us, the average gender pay gap they show is only 2%. But for the financial part, this is 18%. We are only including the salary gender pay gap. We are not even counting for the bonus part. So we can definitely see there is still a long way to go to close the gender pay gap to reach a better gender equality in the financial sector. And also the regional difference is also quite obvious based on our data set. From a disclosing company, we can say for all the Asia company who disclosing to us, their gender pay gap is around 24%. And for some specific country like the Japan and China, their gender pay gap is even more. For all this data, if you are part of the WDI member, you will be able to find more details in our annual report as well. Now let's take a look to say what is the potential reason that driving this gender pay gap. And we can see from the gender breakdown in pay quartiles, for male, they definitely take a lot in the upper pay quartile. 62 male, they're in the upper quartile, but there's only 28 female in the upper pay quartiles. And then there will be less men if the pay quartile move into the bottom, but there will be more female in the bottom quartile. This also shows like the gender pay gap is the structure, it's just the manifestation of the structure inequality. It's because like more female are in the lower bottom pay quartile, and they are in like the relatively lower paying positions, and then this kind of reason can be manifested in the big gender pay gap that are still existing. And also, if we look at in the very center, that like three person icon here, and we can see like female is in the relatively less in the leadership positions. So lots of other like ESG data providers, they do show like the women in the board positions. And for us, for WDI, we break them even further. We break down from the 3 types of leadership role: the board, executive committee, and also senior management. And then we can see it's possibly because like the female in board is part of like the common use the ESG metrics. So there is it's not even, but it looks not that bad. There's 39% female in the board, which is also based on the data collected from WDI. And if we looking at like for the executive committee, like the C-level person, then this number drops a lot. It drops to the 28%. That means even though like we are trying to improve the female representation in the board, we still need to look at like who is in the position that can executive like make some key decisions. And also like the senior management leadership part, that is very close to the executive committees. It's like roughly 32%. That just means like if we go into a little bit down further, like there will be more females in the middle management positions. And this is also kind of like another partial reason like why there is the like still some gender pay gap exists. We definitely need more balanced gender in the leadership position before we can like literally make some changes happen. And that is like some overview of the WDI gender pay gap fact sheet. Once again, like if you're interested in more details, like feel free to request like the gender pay gap fact sheet and also the copy of WDI annual report. We include more insights in this report. I will pass that over to Polly to discuss why it's really matter.
Great. Thanks so much, Joy. And I'm so sorry because the slide deck looks like it might have just paused on us, so it might take a little bit of time to catch up. But yes, so as Joy says, and for those who don't know me, my name is Polly. I'm Research and Campaigns Manager at the WDI. So alongside Joy, I sort of work through our data and basically kind of try and analyze trends from it. So we thought at this point it would be really useful to talk a little bit about why pay gaps matter, why they matter to investors, why they matter to businesses, and why they matter to you. So obviously there is.
Shall we take a second and pause? Maybe I can share my screen to show.
Yeah, it might be worth it just to get the slides up. Sorry, everyone.
Yeah, really sorry about that. Like the share screen suddenly stopped working on our end, so we need to reshare everything. Okay. And also, meanwhile, if you have any questions, feel free to drop that in the Q&A box or in the chat box. We will be more than happy to address any of your concerned questions about this topic. Sorry, please give us one more second. It's really slow.
This is one slide before that.
Yeah, let me go back and share it. Okay. Can anyone see my screen now?
Yes, we can see it. Thanks, Joy.
Good. We'll pass that over to Polly to start.
Great, yes. So we're back. Yeah, we thought it would be useful just to give a bit of an overview of why addressing the gender pay gap is so important to businesses and investors alike. And obviously there is a certain element of it being a social responsibility, and a really important part of the SDGs. But more important than that, it is a strategic business decision that can drive really tangible economic benefits. Everyone, I'm sure, is obviously aware of the recent pushback to DEI efforts, particularly in the States. But research does continue to show that companies that do address the gender pay gap often do achieve improved financial outcomes. McKinsey has recently found, for example, that companies with strong female representation are 25% more likely to outperform companies without a strong female representation. So it's a financial decision more than anything else. There's also a really strong risk component element involved to closing the gender pay gap. In most regions, it's a legal imperative that men and women are receiving equal pay for equal work. So persistent pay disparities can reflect really badly on an organization, especially those that aren't clearly taking steps to improve the gender pay gap and aren't visibly trying to improve it. So by proactively addressing the issue, companies can mitigate both legal and reputational risks. You can see really clearly, actually, an incident of how financially companies can be really impacted by this by a recent court case that has gone on in the UK against UK supermarket giant Asda, and it's a equal pay case. And a recent tribunal has just ruled that 12 out of the 14 lead claimants in a case that involves 60,000 women actually did have equal roles of equal value to their mostly male counterparts, but were paid up to £3.74 less per hour. And this, it's been reported, can have it may well have a payout worth £1.2 billion. So a really large amount. It can have really serious economic consequences. It can also impact a company's access to capital, as investors are increasingly considering ESG factors to help them make allocation decisions that align with their values, their risk management goals, and their long-term performance objectives. PwC has recently projected that $33.9 trillion of global assets under management will consider ESG factors by 2026. And because of this, institutional investors and asset managers who are kind of acting on their behalf are increasingly turning to things like ESG ratings and ESG scores to help inform investment decisions. Gender pay gap does affect these scores. And obviously a low ESG score is starting to get to the point where it can restrict a company's ability to tender for work, to access ESG funding, and to simply attract traditional finance. And this is particularly the case with gender pay gap data because it is such a tangible and measurable metric, and one that's really highly publicized. Often external stakeholders look at it as an indicator for other types of equality like race and disability. And it's just a very clearly used metric for if a company is being socially responsible. So it is, it's highly, highly important. If we move on to the next slide. Thank you so much, Joy. You're doing a very good job of driving. We want to focus just a bit on transparency as the lever for change. Obviously, WDI, it's very integral to our theory of change that by reporting this data, companies can understand their own impacts and make steps to improve it. It helps companies specifically understand whether, how, and to what extent pay gaps exist. And this in turn gives them the ability to address the issue and create more equitable work environments. We have also noticed, and data, our own WDI data proves this, but also so does wider data around the world, that by publishing your gender pay gap, this does drive improvements. There are studies all around the world, but there's a specific one in Denmark that links high pay gap visibility to a reduction in the gender pay gap. There's also further academic research suggesting that companies in which there's pay transparency have a gender pay gap that is 10 to 20% smaller to those that don't. So there are numbers backing up the theory of change, that's for sure. And it is really positive to see that gender pay gap reporting is increasing. We've seen this trend over the last decade and beyond. As of 2023, over half OECD national governments now require private sector employers to report gender pay gap information to external stakeholders. That includes workers, the government, and the public. And our WDI data really backs this up, because where in 2018, I think it was 32% of companies were sharing their gender pay gap. Last year, that was up to 73%, so a really big leap in under a decade. There are a lot of key drivers that are driving this kind of increased reporting. One is obviously public awareness. Consumer groups and advocacy groups in general do view transparency as a reflection of a company's ethical and social responsibility markers. And as covered in the last slide, investor demand is also driving companies to disclose their gender pay gap. Further, recent research has found that institutional investors are willing to put up to 2.6 times as much capital into gender diverse and racially diverse PE firms than they would looking at other companies who don't have the same record. And another really massive aspect of it, which I'm sure is not new to anyone, is the role of governments and regulators in kind of enforcing pay gap legislation. And there's been a massive push on that in the last 15 years. So since 2013, just to race through some of the legislation that's been pushed through, I think it was Denmark introduced mandatory reporting on gender pay gap disparities for large companies in 2013. The UK followed suit in 2017. Loads of other countries, so France, Spain, Italy, Ireland, have introduced similar reporting requirements. In May 2023, the European Union issued its Pay Transparency Directive. Brazil has new legislation insisting that companies report salary differences if they've got more than 100 employees. And in 2022, Japan has also implemented gender pay gap reporting. So yeah, really, really great to see that there's this much legislation, and we can tell from our data that it is driving change. But we did also, as an organization, sort of look at the fact that companies are getting a lot better at reporting kind of top level gender pay gap information, but they're lacking some of the granularity that we believe really drives change, because it really shows where women are most at risk of pay equality in sort of direct operations and value chain. So for example, our data shows us that companies tend to have really clear data when it comes to pay gaps in leadership positions, but are a lot less able to report gaps when it comes to things like contractor workers or value chain workers. And as these workers tend to be a lot more vulnerable, it's a really critical gap. So we encourage companies to really focus on that as an area of reporting. Equally, evidence does show that gender pay gap reporting is really only beneficial when accompanied by kind of the threat of sanctions or consequences, or when their policies are highly visible to external stakeholders. So our WDI survey asks companies not only to share their gender pay gap, but also to clearly state what action it is taking to reduce the pay gaps. And this includes KPIs, policies, and consequences for missing targets, which is a really, really important metric. And then just a couple more that we wanted to kind of highlight as really, really important is companies providing involuntary and voluntary employee turnover rates by gender, because this is often a very overlooked statistic, but it does show the barriers that women face in reaching the higher paying roles. And the final one is internal hire rate by gender. This is such a core indicator because it tests whether D&I initiatives are actually working. And we have noticed that since, despite this being a really, really crucial metric, in 2024, our WDI survey, only 50% of companies disclosed this information. So quite a big gap for what we view as very, very, very critical pay gap data. I hope that was, some useful context for you there. I'm going to hand over to Mary now to introduce herself and talk a little bit about Shareholder Commons and yeah, share a bit of a perspective from a systems stewardship point of view and kind of focusing on why this issue is so important to investors.
Thank you so much. Great. So bear with me for just 1 second. I'll share my own screen. Perfect. Okay, I think we're good to go. So thank you again. Yes, my name is Mari Schwartzer, and I'm the Director of Investor Engagement at the Shareholder Commons. I'm so glad to be here. I really appreciate the opportunity to come and share some of our perspectives about the ways that issues like the pay gap actually impact investors and the economy as a whole. So just to introduce my organization a little bit, the Shareholder Commons is a US-based but globally focused nonprofit with a mission to protect human and ecological systems by shifting investor focus from enterprise value to portfolio value considerations. We work with investors who want to protect their long-term portfolio growth, recognizing that such growth depends upon global ecological, human, and macroeconomic systems. Before I get into it, I need to read a short disclaimer, the full text of which can be found on our website. The Shareholder Commons is not a proxy, legal, or investment advisor, and Portfolios on the Ballot, which is our proxy voting guide that I'll mention later on, does not constitute proxy advisory services or legal or investment advice. Voting decisions are at the discretion of each investor and subject to all relevant laws, including competition and antitrust laws. So with that out of the way, I want to start by kind of setting the scene to say that investors are used to assessing financial risk, but we often overlook how companies can contribute to systemic risk by externalizing costs onto the broader economy, and how those systemic risks are in fact also related to financial risk. So that is where system stewardship comes in. It's about recognizing that long-term value depends upon the health of the systems in which we all operate. And I know there are a lot of company representatives on the call today, so I want to emphasize that although our primary constituency is investors, your investors, I have revised the slide deck and I hope to give you some things to think about in a way that can actually be useful for you as well. Because we know that some investors will come to you asking you to move ahead on various ESG issues, but other investors will come to you asking for cost cutting. And we think that these system stewardship arguments can actually help overcome some of that, because you can go to those investors asking about cost cutting and explain to them how it could actually be harmful to their portfolio. And I'll explain more in a second. So in the end, we think it's better and more efficient for all of us if the systems upon which we rely remain healthy. There we go. I wouldn't proceed. So I'm going to start with a brief introduction about system stewardship, so we're all on the same page. First, the way our global financial system is set up, companies are incentivized to externalize costs. This means that they are rewarded for expanding margins and cutting costs, but when those costs are externalized, they impair social and environmental systems. A good concrete example is the living wage gap, which is conveniently related to our topic today. When companies fail to pay employees what those employees need in order to survive, in other words, a living wage, not only do those individuals and families suffer from that strain, but the critical social systems that are related to that are also impacted. That's because it's not possible for those externalized costs to just go away. They are absorbed by other entities in the greater macroeconomy, other companies, government agencies, other consumers, while the company in question increases its profits. So continuing with the living wage example, as a kind of a concrete to discuss, if a mother is unable to pay her mortgage or rent, unable to keep up with her utility bills, can't pay for medical care, can't pay for childcare, and has trouble feeding her children, all of those expenses still have to be met somehow. So when those costs are externalized and other entities have to pick up those costs, economic growth is negatively impacted. I'll share some data points later on in the presentation. With lower economic growth comes reduced overall market returns. And with lower market returns comes depressed portfolio value. Overall market performance determines as much as 75 to 94% of portfolio returns. The performance of the economy chiefly determines broad market performance. Given that the vast majority of participants in the investing community are highly diversified to take advantage of riskier assets like common stock that also come with potentially a higher reward, most investors should care very much about these macroeconomic impacts on their portfolio. And to try to explain it in a different way, especially for investors in the room that engage their holdings, we think about system stewardship in kind of an is and is not way sometimes. So system stewardship is not a tailored company by company style of engagement, of investor engagement that seeks a win-win compromise, but rather it's about engaging companies to keep them within clear parameters that will help protect the portfolio of diversified investors, but of course, allowing the company to figure out how it best fits within those parameters. System stewardship is about asking companies to take actions that would benefit the overall portfolio of those diversified investors, or avoiding actions that would damage the portfolio and the economy, and focusing on how those actions benefit the investor's portfolio by keeping costs from being externalized. So I'll try to get a little more concrete and apply this theory to our topic today, the gender pay gap. At a high level, we know that economic inequality hinders growth. There's a lot of data on this. Poverty and inequality reduce economic growth, while raising wages can enhance growth. Continuing the gender pay gap reduces the proportion of income that will be spent in the economy, because people who are already wealthy are less likely to spend, they're more likely to save. And it also increases all kinds of inequality beyond wealth inequality, and it misallocates capital. And I know people really love numbers, so I'll do a quick review of just a few pieces of evidence. In 2015, McKinsey found that if women fully participated in the workforce, global GDP would have risen upwards of 28 trillion US dollars by this year, 2015. And just to say it, although I feel like we're probably all very familiar with these concepts, GDP growth usually means that consumers and businesses are spending more. It usually indicates stronger investor and consumer confidence, and it often leads to greater investment, job growth, and stock prices over time. Another piece of evidence, just last year, the World Economic Forum found that gender inequality costs the world 12 trillion US dollars in the global GDP, with some countries experiencing up to a 35% loss. Again, this indicates a depressing of global GDP due to inequality. And one more piece of evidence for today, focusing specifically on some US data here on screen. If the gender pay gap were eliminated in the US, we would see a 2.5% increase of GDP back when this data was calculated in 2019. So eliminating the gender pay gap would allow many women and families, especially single mothers, to achieve economic security. This report by the Institute for Women's Policy Research found that for every state in the US and for the entire nation as a whole, equal pay would provide a significant boost to the economy, helping families across the United States. So just to kind of try to bring this all together and recap, the pay gap reduces one's ability to meet their needs and fully participate in the economy. So they need to rely on other sources to meet those needs, because those needs don't go away. This can include governmental assistance, state funds, thinking of how things work over here in the US, government medical coverage, again, applicable to some countries, including here in the US, or those people may need to find second or third jobs. Not only are people making less money and relying upon more government aid, but they'll pay less in taxes, which will reduce government income. So as an example of how this could play out, with lower government income and higher government expenses, government investments that leads to growth opportunities might be limited. So other businesses, large and small, may not get the support that they need. And as we saw in earlier slides, these factors lead to economy-wide depressed portfolio growth, which is bad for long-term diversified portfolios and bad for the economy as a whole. This evidence relates to how wealth inequality impacts GDP, means that investors with long-term horizons and diversified portfolios, which applies to most institutional investors, pension schemes, company pension plans, and retail investors saving for retirement, would benefit if employers closed the pay gap. And I'll wrap up with my last couple of slides to briefly share how we here at the Shareholder Commons tackle these issues and how we're seeing investors increasingly think about this. In order to tackle a systems-wide issue, investors should take a systemic approach. We advocate for what we call guardrails, minimum parameters for companies to stay within that will help protect the human and ecological systems key to economic growth. We believe that these guardrails should be set by investors based upon their own portfolio expertise and also using outside expert resources on issue area topics. Examples could include equal pay or eliminating the pay gap, paying a living wage, but other examples can include things like abiding by the Paris Accord or following external expert guidance on supply chain issues like antimicrobial resistance. Strategies without this sort of macroeconomic lens typically tailor engagements to each individual company, and then just due to capacity and the fact that many investors own thousands of holdings, it's impossible to apply that sort of individual company by company strategy across an entire portfolio. And that style of engagement also usually doesn't take into account the potential for the company to externalize costs as a result of the engagement. For example, if a company were to respond to equal pay requests by reducing headcount, cutting roles in low-wage job brackets, which usually disproportionately affects women and people of color, or outsourcing jobs, those actions actually externalize other costs into the macroeconomic system. So for the companies on this call, we think that you can use this strategy when talking to your investors. If they come to you and ask for changes that would externalize costs, you can engage in a conversation with them about what you're hoping to achieve and how some of these different macroeconomic impacts could negatively or positively affect their portfolio. We think this can be a tool that you can also use when speaking to your investors. And also, I'll mention that, as I've said many times, our primary constituency is investors, and that's in part because we know that they can come with these questions to their companies, and so we want to help educate them on this sort of theory. And also for the investors on the call, I specifically want to flag a few resources that are on our website that can be useful if you want to think about this more. And one is what you see on screen here. It's a little snippet of our Portfolios on the Ballot proxy voting guide. I want to emphasize that we are not a proxy advisor. We do not make recommendations, but what we do on an annual basis is go out into the world and find shareholder proposals and vote no campaigns that use this macroeconomic lens, and then we flag them for investors to consider voting in favor of based upon this other perspective. So this is our Portfolios on the Ballot proxy voting guide that's available now. And we also have several other toolkit items that investors can check out on our website. Everything from model language that can be considered for inclusion in your own policies, like a proxy voting policy or an investment management policy. But also we have summarized a legal document for easier consumption. We're not lawyers and we do not provide legal advice, but there is a very useful legal text that's out there by a law firm, a wonderful or a notable law firm, and it's a very long document. So we have summarized it to make it more accessible for investors, and that's also available on our website, talking about the ways that fiduciary duty, that's the system stewardship, and how it's important for fiduciary duty. And that's it for me. So my email address is on screen. I'm happy to answer questions, and we're always available. And thank you again to Polly and Joy and the whole team for having me today.
Thank you so much. Sorry.
Sorry, Joy, I don't know why you have an echo. I hope that's okay. Sorry, I was just trying to switch my camera on and stuff. Thank you so much, Mari. That was really, really great. We have had a few questions come through, and there's still time to send some. So members of the audience, please don't feel you've missed your slot. One has been answered in the text, so people want to have a look at that. But we've had a couple of other ones. So Mari, this is probably best for you, but obviously Joy and Polly, feel free to chip in. It's around, do investors mind if a company has a persistently high gender pay gap, or what do investors think of a company with a persistently high gender pay gap, especially because lots of financial companies do have some of the worst pay gaps? Is that something that influences your thinking, do you think?
Yeah, that's a great question. So my organization, we're not issue area experts. So, I mean, we're experts in, I don't know, expert, it feels like a strong word. The work that we do is system stewardship, it's macroeconomic risk. So, we work with investors and the topics that are most critical to them, and we help them translate it into this macroeconomic theory. We help them find the incredible research that's available these days on a whole swath of topics, and then we help them we kind of help them use their own voice to have those conversations. So I couldn't speak to that. I don't have a lot of conversations specifically about the pay gap. I actually wonder if anyone else on the call that has those more targeted issue area conversations might have a better answer.
No, that's great. Thank you, Mari. And yeah, anyone from the audience, do please feel free to, yes, add anything you like. We can also, if you would like to speak, anyone, we can also unmute you. You can't unmute yourselves, but we can give you permission if you did want to contribute verbally. Lovely. Thank you, Mari. Really good insight. Lovely. A couple of other ones. So just making sure that I'm not repeating anything in that question. This is for Mari or Polly or Joy. Do we think the current backlash against ESG will affect efforts to reduce gender and other pay gaps? So probably, I think that means, yeah, ethnicity and or disability pay gaps as well. Do we think that's going to be an issue given the current environment?
I can take this question. Oh, sorry. Okay, so I can take this question. Also, I think this question is also kind of related to another question I can see from the Q&A box. I would say there's definitely some debate is happening in the States about gender pay gap, about DEI, D&I stuff. But I think especially based on what Mari shared about the systematic challenges and benefits, this stuff, I personally do think the ESG watering down will impact on gender pay gap, but not in the long term. In the short term, for sure, I think they may need to be cautious planned about the different initiative they're going to do in the short term in the next 4 years. But considering closing gender pay gap does bring the financial benefits for company in the long term. And we do think if we are thinking about 5 or 10 years, the company they may think about to launch more initiative regarding the closing gender pay gap to bring more female employees into the workforce to actively like contribute to the different developments. And also considering, I think it's also related to the US. I was just wondering, Mary, if you have anything you want to add from your perspective in the States.
Well, actually, I feel like it's almost like self-serving, but I'll say it, which is I would actually, I don't know that I can speak to what will happen, but I think what I can say is we suggest that this like system stewardship perspective and the macroeconomic perspective is a great way for investors to continue engaging on all the ESG topics, the DEI topics that have had so much backlash. Because when you're basing your engagement on the financial argument of what's good for your portfolio, that's a great inoculation against a lot of those arguments, because things have become politicized in a way that I mean, I don't personally think they should have been, but that's where we are, right? Where they become politicized. But a lot of the feedback that we've gotten from investors is that they find that when they're engaging and it's their issue. So in this case, the pay gap. But if they come forward with these arguments that are based in the impacts on the economy, the impacts on their portfolio, that they find it to be a very useful argument that can help kind of protect themselves or protect their argument or their conversations from some of those that pushback. Again, can't provide legal advice, none of that is such, but that's just kind of some of the great feedback that we've gotten. So like maybe it can be helpful for investors to consider that sort of arguments when they're trying to continue to tackle these issues in these challenging times.
This discussion also just reminds me of another research paper I have seen before. So there's one research just like they are using like the Fortune 500 as a sample to analyze what kind of company they're performing better in the long term, based on like the females in the senior leadership, and their research found like females, if they have more females in their leadership positions, the company they are demonstrating a better financial health. So this is why I was thinking, like, even though there's watering down, there's debate happening in the States, but in the long term, we do see there's like it will be good for the company to close the gender pay gap to really like address the structure issues.
I think that's it. Yeah, all really, really solid points. I also think just from the number of companies I speak to, if a company was seen to be stepping back from trying to actively counter and reduce their gender pay gap, I think that would have horrible impacts on their staff retention. So I think it's a very practical aspect as well. Lovely, Joyce. Sorry, did you want to tackle one of the questions specifically next? No, great. Okay, so one of the other ones in the chat is around the UK's recent minimum wage rise, and whether that's going to have an impact on the gender pay gap given the proportion of female workers in a number of low-paid jobs in retail. Do you expect this to be seen in WTI results?
Actually, I think we can expect to see some gender pay gap changes in 2025. And also, I would like to share with anyone who are about to taking part in the 2025 WDI survey. So this year, we are planning to do the data pre-population for around like 3,000 companies, which includes like the lots of like the UK companies for sure. So we will expect to see some like changes in this year's results, especially when we have like much more bigger sample size. And I cannot like make like the judgment at this moment is that definitely have like the positive impact or not, because like the gender pay gap definitely comes from the lower, like I showed at the beginning, like the bottom pay quartile. But you can also say from the upper middle and bottom middle, there are also like the quite big gaps there. So we cannot say like how much the change could be, but there definitely will be something we are expecting to see. But also we want to flag another point here. So this minimum, like there's lots of contractor workers in different industries, especially for some workers they probably is undocumented, like they're migrant workers. So this kind of pay minimum wage raise may not necessarily impact on them. So we cannot say like how positive the change could be, but we are looking forward to see the more close the gender pay gap for sure.
Lovely, thanks, Joy. Just a very practical question that's come up, which obviously we're happy to answer. So it's around when the WGI 2025 disclosure window starts, what the assessments are, when you can expect the results, and whether you get feedback. So yeah, the disclosure window opens on the first Monday in July, which is our traditional date, which this year is the 7th of July. And then the submission deadline is the last Friday in October, which this year is the 31st of October, which is Halloween, which is fun. And the results should then be ready in by mid-January 2026, so a couple of months after you submit, or a few months after you submit. And then absolutely yes, every responder does get feedback, so you get a disclosure scorecard, which if anyone wants to see a sort of a mock-up of that, we can send you one, and everyone is offered a feedback call as well. So that's like a 45-minute, 1 hour feedback call with me, or usually with my colleague Bradley Park, who works with me on company engagement, to go through the response and that scorecard and talk about the data gaps. Lovely. Any other questions? Sorry, just having a quick look in the chat. I think they mostly overlap with other questions we've already done. Sorry, just checking. Okay, one about legislation generally. Does the panel think, or does the speakers think, that legislation around pay gap reporting needs to be stronger? Obviously, we've touched on legislation around the world. Does it need to be stronger than it currently is? Don't know if anyone in particular would like to tackle that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's worth just talking about very quickly about, you know, the massive rollbacks that have happened with the ESRS, with the omnibus ruling in Europe, which has sort of massively cut back on the the kind of data points that companies have to provide and who has to provide them and when it has to be provided. Obviously, there was a lot of conversation going into that about the massive reporting burden that that companies were facing, and that is why kind of European regulators chose to do what they did to ensure that Europe stays as competitive as other countries, particularly with the US kind of mass deregulation move going on. And our view, and I think we did touch on this in the webinar, is that without that really granular detail of sort of where women are being impacted, both in direct operations and value chain, it is challenging to really see where the pay gaps are. I think it's not just about a whole load of data, but it's about identifying the really important data points. And I think with the omnibus, some of those have been missed. But my personal view on it is that companies are aware that they really benefit from these data points and will continue. I think there was a certain amount, or at least it felt from the conversations we were having, there was a certain amount of wait and see, with companies waiting to see what was coming down the line in terms of regulation. That it's going to be a bit more light touch than people originally thought, feared, hoped, whatever it is, whoever it's from. I think just means that companies will start seeking out frameworks and sort of other support systems that help them get the data that they need to benchmark their performance against their peers and to continue to build trust with regulators. So my instinct is that companies will start filling that void in terms of the data gap created by weaker legislation. But Joy, if you want to dive in at all, please do.
That's super. Thank you, Polly. Lovely. I think that's all our questions. Any last burning ones from the audience? If not, we can probably give everyone back a few minutes of their day. Nothing is flashing up on my screen, in which case, thank you so much, Mari, for joining us. Really, really, really useful. As you say, we will make sure your resources are available to everyone. This session has been recorded as well, so we will put that up on the TRF YouTube channel as well for people to watch back. Lovely.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, Mari.
Thank
Lovely.
you.
Thanks, everyone. Take care. Bye.
Bye.